Now, I understand that Douglas Carswell is in the building, and he's about to come into the room. Before he arrives, I'll just say a few words about Douglas. He's really an outstanding parliamentarian, and there are very few outstanding parliamentarians at the current time. He's somebody that has views, and he follows through the consequences of those views. He's a believer in decentralization and direct democracy. And he's realized that if he believes in those two things, they're not really compatible with EU membership. And that is why Douglas is campaigning for an in-out referendum, which he is going to speak about this evening. He's made quite an impact in the House. He was elected in 2005 with a majority of 920 votes, and he's now got his majority up to 12,000. So he certainly seems to be doing something that is connecting with the local voters, and he's one of the few members of Parliament that actually wants to get out of the European Union. He also played a leading part in getting rid of Speaker Martin. He was the first MP to call for Speaker Martin to go. I was just coming on to that. When he said that, he got the usual reaction that you get in the House of Commons when you say anything that's out of kilter with the mainstream. Oh, you can't possibly suggest that, and it's just not practical to get rid of a speaker. It's just not cricket. But fortunately, Speaker Martin did go, but unfortunately, as the member in the front row of the audience pointed out, they elected someone of very dubious worth in the form of Speaker Bercow. But there we are. We can't criticise Douglas for trying. So, Douglas, the floor is now yours to explain why we require an in-out referendum.
Ladies and gentlemen, I apologise for being late. I was at a vote at the House of Commons on whether or not we should have what they call the European External Action Service, a European diplomatic corps. I was one of a handful of people in the House who voted against us having a European External Service. And you think there's been a change of government. I wanted this evening to talk about why I think we need to withdraw from the European Union, and a bit about how I think we could make that happen. Many of the things that I think we need to do to make it happen, I think require those of us who perhaps throughout our adult lives have regarded ourselves as being conservative. I think we need to embrace some things that are distinctly unconservative if we're ever going to achieve that, and I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by that. It seems to me that the arguments for coming out from an economic point of view get stronger by the day. We were supposed to justify our EU membership, the common market, the European Economic Community, largely on the basis of the economic advantage that it would confer upon us. We were told that if we joined the common market, we would be in a stronger position economically than if we remained outside. I really don't think that that is something that can be justified. Years of common policies governing the way that Europe's agriculture works means that today European agriculture receives billions of pounds worth in subsidy, but is perhaps not as good as others are in actually producing foodstuff at a price that people are willing to pay. Years of Europe managing our fish stocks means that there are neither fish, nor fishermen, nor fishing fleets. Years of Europe managing micromanagerial directives mean that small businesses suffer. Europe is simply not a very good place anymore to create wealth. There are other parts of the planet, not governed by Brussels, which somehow seem to be better at creating wealth than Europe is. As Europe has grown into an ever closer union, it seems that the dynamism that Europe once had, that allowed its different polities to innovate, have been lost. Our GDP, Europe's GDP as a percentage of the global total, is falling, and falling pretty dramatically. European manufacturing. Let's remember that the forerunner of the political unification of the continent was a common steel and coal policy. You know, Europe is simply not a place where it really pays to make things anymore. I don't think that anyone can look at how Europe is faring economically without being alarmed at some of the debts that some European countries have racked up. How monetary policy, the euro, the ultimate fiat currency, has allowed some governments to spend recklessly. And I think if we look around us, we can quite clearly see that one of the consequences of having a harmonized monetary policy and harmonized interest rates has been the ruin of certain European economies. I think it's fair to say that if European economies were each allowed to manage their own interest rates, they would have had a better monetary policy than they've had. But why stop at monetary policy? Why not let different European countries manage their own economic affairs themselves? In fact, if that happened, if we had genuine free trade rather than a single corporatist rigged market, I think Europe could have all the advantages of prosperity without the cumbersome costs of this corporatist union. But I think the argument for coming out of the European Union isn't simply because Europe is not prospering. Look at the world around us. Today, when I was talking to a group of German and English students, one of them said to me, but you know, you can't possibly come out of the European Union. Most of our trade is with Belgium and Germany. Surely that is the problem. Look around at where wealth is being created in India, America, China. We are locking ourselves into an economic and political union with a part of the world that is not prospering. And I think we're missing a huge opportunity by remaining part of it. Added to that is the obvious truth. I say obvious because if you go into any shop in this country and look at how many products on the shelves are made in China, it's pretty obvious you don't need political union in order to have prosperous trading relations. So I think the economic case, put far more eloquently than I can by others, against ever closer union is becoming overpowering. But I think there's a political reason why we need to come out as well. I've noticed in the short time that I've been a Member of Parliament, there are huge areas of public policy in this country where people like me, those you vote for, those you send to the House of Commons, frankly have no say at all. I was invited by the Edmund Burke Society to give a talk about Edmund Burke, and it struck me that one of the most hotly contested issues in his time was trade. No MP in my lifetime has ever really been able to debate trade in any meaningful way in this country, because trade policy is not determined by those we elect. There are a whole range of areas, agricultural policy, fishing policy, where for all the hot air generated in Westminster, none of the key decisions are any longer made there. I was particularly struck as a new MP at how few of the issues that affect the lives of my constituents are actually left for MPs to discuss and debate and decide. Little things, well, we call them little things in Westminster, but actually they're pretty important things in the lives of our constituents, like how often your garbage bin is emptied. People often complain that the council will only empty their bins fortnightly. Well, the EU Landfill Directive. It seems that the nooks and crannies of micromanagement from Brussels hasn't just stagnated and stifled our economy. It's stagnated and stifled our democracy. Again and again you come across quangos, and there are so many that there's a sort of alphabet soup of them, that they run out of letters of the alphabet to name them all, which decide things. And if you look closely and carefully, those quangos don't receive their instructions often from elected MPs in the House of Commons, but apply policy directly from Brussels. The Food Standards Agency, the FSA, there are a whole host of these quangos that increasingly, the DVLA, that increasingly receive instructions directly from Europe. In fact, most public policy is now made for us by unelected officials in Brussels. Most law is now made and authored for us by unelected officials in Brussels. And I can't help thinking that one of the reasons why people have grown to despise our Westminster system, grown to despise our MPs, is because MPs have become literally parasitical. They cost a great deal in terms of subsidies for duck houses, but they're just not very good at actually deciding the things that matter. And one of the reasons why I suspect people increasingly don't vote, why voter turnout seems to be falling, one of the reasons why there is this growing contempt for the political process, one of the reasons why on doorstep after doorstep I hear people saying all you politicians are the same, is not because we really are all the same, but because in terms of what we can actually do, in terms of policy we can actually decide, more and more power has been ceded to unelected officials in the Quango state, at the apex of which sits the European Commission in Brussels. I think we need to renew our democracy as much and as desperately as we should reinvigorate our economy. And I simply don't think that we can do that while we remain members of the European Union. How can we withdraw from the European Union and become an independent country once again? Well, I'm often called radical for wanting Britain to be an independent country, but I look around me and I see countries around the world, liberal democracies, Australia, Singapore, Switzerland, America, New Zealand, Canada, in fact, India, country after country, that is basically a self-governing liberal democracy. What we're asking for is not radical. What we're asking for is liberal and democratic and mainstream around the world. One of the reasons, however, why it's portrayed as being extreme is because we face a number of very powerful vested interests in this country for whom EU membership is suitable. And I want to talk a bit about that. The first and the most powerful vested interest who wants us to remain in the European Union are big corporations and big business. Now, sometimes on the centre-right, we've made the fatal mistake of believing that being pro-business is the same as being pro-free market. It isn't. And I don't think we should be afraid to speak out against big corporate interests. It's not the preserve of the left to be anti-big corporate interests. There are big corporate interests who rather like the EU. It allows them to erect barriers to entry in their markets. It allows them to rig the market to their advantage. It allows them to engage in public procurement contracts that exclude the more nimble competitor. Big business is often pro the EU, not because they love the free market, though they will talk a lot about the single market, but precisely because the single market is not a free market. It is a rigged corporatist market. The second group of vested interests who like our EU membership are the politicians. Not all of them, but many of them. If you have to do something that's a bit unpopular, it's quite nice to be able to go back to your constituent elements in the Commons or your constituency and blame someone else. Again and again, policies that the people would not wear if they had to make the choice themselves are imposed and foisted upon the people because we're told it is a prerequisite of our EU membership. We're told that the Council of Ministers has agreed. We're told that it is in our interests because Europe said so. I wonder if there is a conspiracy of interest between politicians to blame the EU for doing things that they dare not do for themselves and in their own name. And I think we need to recognise this, and we need to recognise that, again and again, the political establishment in Westminster, it has quite suited them that we remain in the EU because it allows them to escape the wrath of their electorates. It also suits officials to be in the EU. Officials can be upwardly accountable to other officials under the EU in a way that would be unimaginable in a proper, independent, liberal democracy. Again and again as an MP, when I've challenged an official why it is that they are allowing managed retreats rather than spending taxpayers' money on sea defences, or why it is that they are imposing some ludicrous system, the answer comes back, EU directive this, EU directive that. It suits many officials for us to remain in the EU and to further embed ourselves in the EU. I think the group of officials that it most benefits for us to remain in the EU are the officials who, in many ways, have been the driving force behind our EU membership, the Foreign Office. We often talk about quangos in this country, but I think one of the most preeminent, oldest quangos in this country is the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. They have been largely free to pursue foreign policy in their interests without reference often to democratically elected politicians. Isn't it extraordinary? if you look back at who has been the Europe Minister over the past 20 or 30 years, how different a background the Labour Europe Minister may be from the Conservative Europe Minister, isn't it striking how often the Europe Minister ends up doing precisely the same thing regardless of what colour rosette they wore on election day? Again and again, it is the Foreign Office that is deciding policy, and ministers, whichever MP claims to be running the Foreign Office at the time, is all too often left to just justify the official views of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. How do we challenge these powerful vested interests? Let's face it, I've been campaigning against our EU membership for all of my adult life, and it's not been wholly successful so far. We've suffered defeat and retreat. We've not been very successful. Well, I think we need to recognise that we ourselves need to get quite radical. We need to recognise that we need a system not of deferential democracy, where we absurdly worship the baubles that are handed to us by the existing regime in Westminster. We need a system of direct democracy. We need to start to demand that politics is not something done for us by a remote priesthood of politicians in Westminster. Politics is not something that the big party machines offer us once every few years. We need a system of direct democracy that allows us greater say over our lives. Is it not a coincidence that the country with the most direct system of democracy in Europe, Switzerland, has remained firmly outside of the EU? I think we need to look to try to emulate many of the ideas of direct democracy that exist not just in Switzerland, but in America and in other countries. If we are to create a political class in Westminster who genuinely reflect the concerns of the people about our EU membership, I think we need to start to demand greater control over them. We need to start to demand things like a right of recall, so that if a politician is elected on an election address to give us a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty and they renege on it, we can recall them. I think we need to embrace things like a popular initiative, a right of popular initiative, so that things that matter to the citizen can be debated and voted on in the House of Commons in a way they never seem to be under the current political arrangements. I think we need to ultimately embrace the idea of referendums, not as exceptional things that we use only for things we dislike, but as the everyday currency of political discourse in this country. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it was necessary for us to send our elected representatives to a palace on the banks of the Thames to make decisions on our behalf. The fact is that they have grown pretty monumentally useless at doing that. The House of Commons is not good at overseeing those who hold executive power. Politicians have been allowed to impose their madcap schemes like membership of the EU and all sorts of other things without real reference and regard to the people. If we had a system of direct democracy, I think we would be able to make sure that instead of leaving it to a legislature to hold government to account, the people would have a direct say, a direct voice. So I think we need to not simply campaign for a referendum on our EU membership. I think the entire centre-right needs to stop being quite so small c conservative and start being much more radical, much more bold, arguing for the sort of things that perhaps we've been reluctant to argue for. I think if we were to embrace a system of direct democracy and radical control over the political process with these mechanisms of direct control, I think we would start to see politicians who actually took seriously our concerns, who recognise that EU membership is something that is not negotiated in their interests, but something that should only be undertaken in our interests. I think if 60 million people were involved in the decision as to whether we remain members of the EU, people would overwhelmingly vote for us to leave. Some people will talk about different types of tactics, how we could renegotiate our membership of the EU. Personally, I'm campaigning for an in-out referendum. Anything less than an in-out referendum, I believe, opens up the possibility that vested interests can ultimately scupper our voice. And I'm amazed at how often it is that good Eurosceptics often seem to think that they can settle for something less than the restoration of our national sovereignty. If we were to have an in-out referendum, and if people were to vote overwhelmingly for us to withdraw from the EU, and if we were to withdraw from the EU, which can be done, despite the vested interests, the big corporations, the politicians, the officials, the diplomats, and I forgot to mention the judiciary, arguing against it. Once we had come outside the EU, once we had left the EU, I think it would be perfectly possible for us to have very good relations with our neighbours, relations that allowed the free mobility of goods and services, some movement of people, and a freer movement of people than we would otherwise have. I think we could do all sorts of things that would ensure that we had cooperation where we wanted it. I think it would be good for us in this country to have good relations with Europe. I fear that so long as we remain members of the EU, we have a closeness with Europe that benefits the political elite and the diplomats, but doesn't actually do much for ordinary people, ordinary shoppers, ordinary consumers. Yes, we need good relations with Europe. Those are best obtained by being outside the EU. Thank you.